This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is testifying today on Capitol Hill as his company's actions face escalating criticism. The focus of today's House hearing is on Facebook's plan to launch a cryptocurrency called Libra that could reshape the world's financial system. Zuckerberg will reportedly tell legislators he supports delaying the launch of Libra until U.S. regulators approve it. According to his prepared remarks, Zuckerberg will say, quote, "I believe this is something that needs to get built, but I understand we're not the ideal messenger right now. I know some people wonder whether we can be trusted to build payment services that protect consumers," he's apparently going to say. Today's hearing comes as Facebook faces intense scrutiny on a number of grounds. On Tuesday, New York Attorney General Letitia James announced that her probe of Facebook for violating antitrust regulations is now backed by attorneys general from 46 other U.S. states and territories. James said the states are, quote, concerned that Facebook may have put consumer data at risk, reduce the quality of consumers' choices, and increase the price of advertising. Facebook is also facing criticism from several Democratic presidential candidates for refusing to ban political ads containing false information. Meanwhile, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has repeatedly called for Facebook and other big tech companies to be broken up on antitrust grounds. Well, today we spend the hour with a man who once mentored Zuckerberg and was an early investor in Facebook, but has since become one of Facebook's most vocal critics. Roger McNamee joins us from Pittsburgh. He's been an investor in Silicon Valley for over 35 years. He's advised Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and many others. Earlier this year, he published the book Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Roger McNamee, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you start off by explaining why you call Facebook a catastrophe?
So, Amy, first of all, thank you very much. It is such a privilege to be here on Democracy Now! With you today. So, Facebook really simply began its life in a very innocent way, connecting friends to friends and allowing people to share what was going on in their lives. The challenge really developed when the company needed to make money, and so it began creating a business model that was based on effectively monopolizing attention. They sell advertising. They need people to watch the ads. And the way they did that was to use two things: the techniques of slot machines and propaganda that prey on the weakest elements of human psychology. And then they used smartphones, which basically were on people's bodies 24 hours a day and created the ability to generate first habits and then later addiction. And Facebook, along with Google and other products like Instagram and YouTube, played this game incredibly effectively. And they did so at a time when there really were no rules for businesses. I mean, essentially, the American economy has been deregulating for 40 years, and so there's nobody watching the store. And smart people take what they can get, and the people at Facebook and Google are really smart. And they basically made a play for a global consumer internet product that would essentially touch everyone around the world and bring them into a single network and manipulate their behavior for profit. And it's been amazingly successful in economic terms, but it's caused huge harms to democracy, to public health, to privacy, and frankly, to the structure of the economy itself. And in my mind, we have a huge challenge because as users, we really like these products. We like Facebook, we like Instagram, we like YouTube. But we have to learn to accept that things we like can sometimes do great harm to society. And that's what's happened, Amy.
Explain its threat to democracy, Roger.
Very simply put, the way that Facebook works, and the same would be true of Instagram and YouTube and Google search engine, they need you to spend a lot of time. And so the first thing they do is they use notifications to build the habit. Once you're addicted, once you're coming back multiple times a day, they have to find ways to keep you on the site. And the simplest way to do that is to reinforce whatever content gets you to share or like or comment. It turns out For most of us, the content that does that is stuff that triggers flight or fight, which is essentially a part of our psychology that's so deeply wired we can't avoid it. The content that does that best is hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Effectively, what happens on Facebook is they bombard you with the stuff you react to, and it blocks out all other forms of communication. So you wind up being in what is called a filter bubble, which is essentially an artificial reality where everything appears to reinforce the things you already like or the things you already believe. And it blocks out any new ideas. And in a democracy, that's terrible because it increases polarization. Essentially, each one of us is in our own Truman Show. And if we're not careful, we wind up having our own set of facts. And you see this every day. I mean, 1/3 of Americans do not believe there's any relationship between human activity and climate change. That is demonstrably false. There's another 7 or 8% who believe there is a linkage between vaccination and autism, which is clearly not true. Well, in a democracy, if you can't agree on the facts, you can't have debate, you can't have compromise. And Facebook has played a larger role than any other platform at increasing this polarization. They've had a lot of help from YouTube and Instagram, but Facebook has been the one that's done it worst.
And why a threat to public health?
So on public health, there's a bunch of different things going on in public health. Quite obviously, if people live in a fantasy world, if they live in a Truman Show, and they're angry all the time, right? If people are constantly being bombarded with stuff that triggers fear or outrage, that's just not going to be good for their mental health. But let's think about children. You have huge issues on products like Instagram with bullying and body shaming. We've seen a very mysterious but alarming increase in teen suicide, and it has been suggested that there may be a link to social media in terms of increasing that pressure at this very vulnerable time in children's lives. And then obviously there are products that Facebook has and that especially Google and Microsoft have. They're aimed at really little kids. So Microsoft has Minecraft, Facebook has Messenger for kids, and Google has Chromebooks and all of their educational products. And those things are designed essentially to train really little kids for this world of surveillance that is so core to the business model of internet platforms.
In a moment, we're going to talk about how you came to know Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, what you said to them, your advice, the direction they're going in today, the significance of his testifying on Capitol Hill, talking also about cryptocurrency. But I just wanted to get your comment on the latest news that 47 states and U.S. territories are now joining with New York investigating Facebook, charging it with antitrust violations.
Well, so, Amy, this is a really important initiative. If you had asked me 2 years ago whether I thought it was likely that we would see antitrust action against Google or Facebook, I would have said it was very, very unlikely. Essentially, the Republican Party has had as a core strategy to dismantle antitrust as one of the government's functions is the arbiter of capitalism. And so we've reduced the opportunities for antitrust to something so small that effectively it appeared that internet platforms like Google and Facebook would be untouchable. In reality, they commit antitrust violations every single day. And the good news is that state attorneys general are in a position to act on this because many states have privacy laws. Many of them have consumer protection laws that these companies have violated every single day. And we see 47 states and territories going after Facebook. We see 50 going after Google. This is incredibly welcome. It's incredibly important. This is the very beginning of a process that's likely to take several years. But in my opinion, this is the most likely antitrust venue to have success in. And I think it's super important that it work because these companies act as though they're not accountable to anybody. And in that context, they do great harm and escape any kind of punishment for it. And that just is wrong.
We're going to break, and when we come back, we want to find out exactly how you got zucked, how you met Mark Zuckerberg, and the evolution of that relationship, along with the evolution of Facebook. We're talking to Roger McNamee. He's the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. He's had a 34-year career in Silicon Valley, was an early investor. So talk about how you met Mark Zuckerberg and talk about the evolution of the company.
So, Amy, when I met Mark, it was in 2006. I had already spent 24 years, nearly half of my life, investing in Silicon Valley. And it was a normal thing for me to be consulted by young entrepreneurs who just wanted some perspective on how Silicon Valley worked. I got an email from one of Mark's colleagues saying, "My boss has a crisis. Would you be willing to take a meeting with him?" I was really excited about the idea because while I could not use Facebook at that time, you had to be a student with an email address from your school. I was convinced Facebook was the next big thing. I was convinced that the requirement that you had to be who you said you were, with authenticated identity from your school email address, and the ability to control who could see your private information, I thought those two things changed everything and would allow Facebook to eventually be bigger than Google was at that time. So I was really excited to meet Mark, and he comes into my office, and I tell this story in the book. I'll give you the very short version of it. I said, "Mark, before you say anything, I've got to tell you why I took this meeting." Because I said, "I think you got the most important thing since Google, but before long, either Microsoft or Yahoo is going to offer $1 billion for Facebook, and everybody you know is going to tell you to take the money. And I'm here to tell you that if you want to see your vision come to fruition, you have to do it yourself." What followed that, Amy, was the most painful 5 minutes of my entire life. Mark, one of his great strengths is he does not act without thinking things through very carefully. And in this particular context, he decided to think about what I said before he reacted. He wanted to decide if he trusted me. But it took 5 minutes, and you know from television how painful silence can be when you're expecting a response from someone. Long story short, it turned out that Yahoo had offered $1 billion, and as I had predicted, everyone told Mark to sell the company, and that was the reason he was there to see me. He wanted to find out how he could keep the company independent. I helped him solve that problem, and for 3 years thereafter, I was one of his mentors. And my role was very narrow, but important to both of us, because everybody in the company wanted to sell out, and so he needed to rebuild his management team. And the most important person that I recommended to him and helped to bring into the company was Sheryl Sandberg. And I'd known Sheryl for a number of years because she'd introduced me to Bono, the U2 lead singer, who was my business partner. He became my business partner after Sheryl introduced him. And so I knew Sheryl really, really well, and I'd helped her get into Google, and we were very close, and I thought she'd be a really good fit for Mark. I thought the two of them would balance each other and provide complementary skills, and for many years that was true.
So talk about when you started to get disillusioned.
So imagine it took place in two phases, Amy. The first part of it was I got disillusioned with Silicon Valley. Beginning around 2010, with the financing of Spotify, and then going on to Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, and then Juul, I started to see companies that were clearly the best of what Silicon Valley had to offer, but whose essential being violated my values. That Airbnb and Uber and Lyft were really about breaking the law, that they basically said the law doesn't apply to us. And Spotify was about essentially profiting at the expense of musicians. And Juul, of course, was about addicting young people to nicotine. And I just said, I can't keep investing other people's money if I'm not willing to invest in the best stuff coming out of my community. So I decided it was time for me to retire. And when I made the decision in 2012, my fund still had a few years to run, so I had to wait till it ended. It ended at the end of 2015. And then immediately, January of 2016, in the context of the Democratic primary in New Hampshire, I saw hate speech being circulated from Facebook groups that were notionally associated with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And it was obvious that Bernie had nothing to do with it, but the thing that was also obvious was that the that the hate speech was spreading so virally that someone had to be spending money to get my friends into these groups. And that really disturbed me. Then I saw civil rights violations relative to Black Lives Matter taking place using the advertising tools of Facebook. But the clincher for me came in June of 2016 with the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. That was the first time that I realized, oh my God, the same advertising tools that make Facebook so useful for a marketer can be used to undermine democracy in an election. That was when I started looking for allies, and I couldn't find any. And eventually, I was given an opportunity to write an opinion piece for the Recode Tech blog to raise my concerns. And before I got finished with it, in early October, the U.S. government announced the Russians were interfering in the election. And at that point, I scrambled to finish the draft, and I sent it to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. I mean, they were my friends. I'd been their mentor. And I was really worried that something about the culture, the business model, and the algorithms of Facebook was allowing bad actors to harm innocent people. And I couldn't believe that that Facebook would do this on purpose. And so I went to warn them 9 days before the presidential election. And unfortunately, they treat it like a PR problem, not like a business issue. And they were nice enough in the sense that they had one of their colleagues work with me for 3 months, to let me try to lay out my case. So between basically the end of October of 2016 and February of 2017, I was begging Facebook to do what Johnson & Johnson did after the Tylenol poisoning in Chicago in 1982. The CEO dropped everything. He withdrew every bottle of Tylenol from every retail shelf until they invented tamper-proof packaging. And I thought Facebook should do something like that, should work with the government to find out everything the Russians were doing, to find out every other way the platform was being abused, either to violate civil rights or to undermine democracy. But for whatever reason, maybe I was the wrong messenger, maybe something about the way I delivered the message didn't work, but they didn't take it seriously, and I realized I was faced with a choice. I was so proud of that company, and I've been so closely involved, but I felt like I knew something I had to share with everybody, that I couldn't just sit back and be retired and let it go by. And so I decided to become an activist, which is something I never anticipated doing. And I've spent essentially the last 3 years every day doing nothing but trying to make the world aware of the dark side of internet platforms like Facebook, like Google, and to help people both protect themselves, but to protect their children, to protect democracy, and to protect the economy. I think in Mark's mind, he is doing the right thing. But here's where the problem comes in, Amy. Mark believes that the mission of connecting the whole world on one seamless, frictionless platform is the most important thing anybody can do on Earth, and it justifies any means necessary to get there. I'm sure in his own mind, they felt like they've been open with people, but the reality is quite different. Facebook is designed to be opaque. Google is designed to be opaque. And in a sense, they work together because Google manages all of the infrastructure behind digital advertising, and so they play a role in that whole ecosystem that allows companies like Facebook to prevent anyone from inspecting what's going on. And the truth is, they had to know before the election that there was something really wrong, because I'm sure I was not the only one who brought it to their attention. But at the end of the day, their view of the world is that they should just connect everybody and not be responsible for the consequences. What they told me was, they said, Roger, the law says we're a platform, not a media company. We're not responsible for what third parties do. And I said, Mark, Sheryl, this is a trust business. The law doesn't protect you if your users believe that you're undermining democracy, if they believe that you're harming civil rights, if you're harming public health, if you're harming privacy. There's no protection against that, and that's what we're seeing today. And the issue that I run into is that in 2016, I'm willing to accept that maybe they didn't pick up the right signals. God knows I didn't. But once they were informed, once people like me, once President Obama went to Mark, there was no excuse. And they have clearly spent the entire time since then trying to use misdirection to keep us from seeing what really happened there, denying, deflecting, and delaying any kind of investigation. If they were really sincere about this, they would have shown us every ad the Trump campaign showed on the platform. They would have shown everything that the Russians did. They would have given us all the billing records. They would have done all of that kind of stuff. But they quite clearly haven't done that. And it goes way beyond just elections, right? You have terrorism in Christchurch, New Zealand. You have ethnic cleansing in the Asian country of Myanmar. You have hate speech around the world. You have mass killings in the United States. I mean, all of these things were enabled by internet platforms like Facebook. And they didn't go out of their way to cause them to happen, but they never put in place any safety nets, any firewalls, anything to protect users from the bad actors who are empowered by the way the algorithms and the culture and the business model of Facebook work.
So that's Mark Zuckerberg. I heard Mark Zuckerberg's free expression speech and the challenges MLK faced from disinformation campaigns launched by politicians. These campaigns created an atmosphere for his assassination. Your response, Roger?
I got to tell you, I think what Mark said there was horrific. I mean, it was disingenuous. It was not an honest telling either of what Facebook does or of how history worked. Here's the issue. Mark wants us to treat Facebook with respect on First Amendment grounds, that this is an issue of free speech. And here's where the problem comes up. The question that we're talking about here is whether Facebook should be allowed to have falsehoods in political advertising. They had a rule for the longest time that they couldn't have false advertising anywhere. When they were called out on this issue recently, instead of fixing the problem, they changed the rule to say, from now on, we're not going to have fact-checking of political ads. So the question is, does that constitute free speech? Is that about free expression? And I would argue that's not anything at all about that. And the reason is because Facebook ads are micro-targeted. The only people who see them are people who are carefully selected. So in an issue of free speech, if everyone got to see every single ad in the political context, then Mark's statement might have a little bit of viability. But they don't. This is all about organized campaigns designed to manipulate vulnerable populations. And the second problem we have here is that Mark's business, based on advertising, requires him to amplify the most engaging content that people see. And the problem is that the most engaging content on any internet platform is the stuff that triggers flight or fight, our most basic human instinct. Well, in that context, we're really talking about hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And there is no way in God's green earth you can convince me that free expression is aided by the amplification of hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories over facts or over any kind of neutral conversation. I just think everything he's saying is completely self-serving. It's not intellectually honest, and none of us should take it seriously.
On Capitol Hill last year, Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Chris Wiley told the Senate Judiciary Committee that the voter profiling company sought to suppress turnout among African-American voters and preyed on racial biases. Wiley testified that Cambridge Analytica harvested the data of up to 87 million Facebook users without their permission and used the data to, quote, fight a culture war. Cambridge Analytica was founded by billionaire Robert Mercer. Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon of Breitbart News was one of the company's key strategists. Wiley said he left the company due to efforts to disengage voters and target African Americans. This is Chris Wiley.
Cambridge Analytica sought to identify mental vulnerabilities in voters and worked to exploit them by targeting information designed to activate some of the worst characteristics in people, such as neuroticism, paranoia, and racial biases. To be clear, the work of Cambridge Analytica is not traditional marketing. Cambridge Analytica specialized in disinformation, spreading rumors, compromat, and propaganda.
So that's Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Chris Wiley testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Roger McNamee, if you can talk about the whole explosive, expose of Cambridge Analytica and its relationship with Facebook and how Zuckerberg dealt with it.
So the thing to understand, Amy, is that Cambridge Analytica was in the political psychological operations business. They were willing to sell their services to anyone, and they sold them in many countries around the world. They essentially had some kind of relationship to the Leave.eu campaign for Brexit in the United Kingdom, and they had a relationship with the Trump campaign, originally with the Ted Cruz campaign, but then the Trump campaign. And their goal was very simple, was to identify groups whose votes could be suppressed. And in the context of the Trump campaign, that was suburban white women, people of color, and idealistic young people. And essentially, the goal was not to convert them from being Clinton voters to being Trump voters, but in fact, to find Clinton voters who could be, with a targeted, micro-targeted, focused campaign, discouraged from voting at all. And it was demonstrably successful. And the thing is, there's no law against it today. The way things are set up, we never anticipated the ability to have the level of addiction that a smartphone would create, and therefore the ease of emotional manipulation that would allow in a political context. Micro-targeting is practiced by Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube in the context of a political campaign is asymmetrical in the most extreme form, because an ethical campaign will not use that kind of technology. Only an unethical campaign will. And so at the end of the day, we're left with this situation where it empowers people who have bad intentions at the expense of democracy itself. And we need to have laws that reflect the impact of technology in our democracy. And that is one of the highest priorities in my mind that Congress should have, both as an election issue in 2020 and then for the period immediately following. So I think the issue for all members of Congress, irrespective of what committee they're on, essentially distills to the same thing, which is, Mr. Zuckerberg, you've built one of the most successful businesses in American history, but at enormous cost. To me, Facebook is like the oil companies of the 50s. It's artificially profitable because it pours waste products wherever it feels like. Think about it. In the 50s, chemical companies would pour mercury into fresh water. Mining companies would leave the residue wherever it fell. Gas stations would pour oil into the sewer. And the destruction to our public health and to our environment was enormous. And eventually, we woke up and realized that the oil companies should be responsible for all this. And I believe that every member of Congress, in fact, everyone at every level of government in the United States and elsewhere, needs to hold internet platforms accountable, because what they're creating are toxic digital spills. And they're doing enormous harm to society. And in financial services, in my mind, their question today relates to a cryptocurrency. There is no way in God's green earth Facebook should be allowed to do that. But not just Facebook. No corporation should be allowed to create a currency that competes with the dollar. That's just not in the national interest. In fact, you mentioned a moment ago Greta Thunberg. If I can just pivot slightly, there's a point I would love to make to all of the viewers, which is, if you look at the biggest issues we face as a country, whether it's climate change, whether it's anti-vax, whether it is gun violence or white supremacy or anti-immigrant, on every one of these issues, the harmful side of the argument, the one that is denying climate change or is promoting anti-vax or promoting gun violence or white supremacy, in each case, that side gets amplification because of internet platforms that gives them more political power than their numbers should allow. And if we want to fix climate change, if we want to fix gun violence or end the mania of anti-vax, we're going to have to do something about internet platforms. And that is the common issue affecting politics across all of America. And let's understand, this is not an accident. This stuff is not about the freedom of speech or freedom of expression. It's about the fact that these companies amplify hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories because that stuff is just more profitable for them. And in my mind, they should no more be allowed to do that than a chemical company should be allowed to pour mercury into fresh water.
So let me ask you about some of what you wrote in Zucked. I mean, all of these issues you raise. But you write about changes that grew the social network into the giant it is today. You say, in researching this book for key moments in the history of Facebook, one that stands out occurred months before I got involved. In the fall of 2005, Facebook gave users the ability to upload photographs. They did it with a new wrinkle, tagging the people in the photo that helped to define Facebook's approach to engagement. Tagging proved to be a technology with persuasive power, as users felt obligated to react or reciprocate when informed they'd been tagged. A few months after my first meeting with Zuck, Facebook made two huge changes. It launched News Feed, and it opened itself up to anyone over the age of 13 with a valid email address. Keep talking about News Feed and the significance of photographs when it comes, for example, to the issue of privacy, and what Mark Zuckerberg understood.
So I think that Zuck had a clear understanding of these issues that I gave him credit for at the time. His notion of collecting everyone in the world on one network, had elements in it of virtue. You could see that there were cases, as with the Women's March or Black Lives Matter or the March for Our Lives, where you could use a network like that to organize people for good. The problem with it is that the way Mark did it, the way he did all of these things, was to eliminate friction. His notion was he didn't want people thinking about posts. He just wanted them scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And by eliminating the friction, he eliminated essentially the opportunity for people to adapt to what he was doing. He eliminated really opportunities for creativity, for contemplation and debate. And in doing so, he really has undermined the social fabric of the country. And it started so innocently. Photo tagging doesn't seem like a big deal, but it does trigger this need for social reciprocity, which is essentially involuntary in us. And it becomes that way. He eliminated really opportunities for creativity, for contemplation and debate. And in doing so, he really has undermined the social fabric of the country. And it started so innocently. Photo tagging doesn't seem like a big deal, but it does trigger this need for social reciprocity, which is essentially involuntary in us. And it becomes a habit. They send you a notification. You think the notification's personal. It's from an AI. And it's there to provoke you. And it provokes you enough to create a habit. And for most of us, the habit becomes an addiction. And I say it's an addiction because ask yourself this. I mean, Amy, when do you check your smartphone first thing in the morning? Is it before you pee or while you pee? Because for most of us, that's the range, right? Nobody waits until after they're done. And so at the end of the day, once they have us addicted, they own us. And then after that, it's about the manipulation and amplification of hostile voices in order to keep this whole thing moving and profitable for them. And it started innocently, and it happened like a frog in water coming to a boil, right? We just didn't notice what was going on. And each new thing was more convenient than the last thing, and convenience is a narcotic. We're all hooked to it. And the trick here is we now have to recognize that, wait a minute, we actually have things in common. That meeting face-to-face, making eye contact is actually really valuable, and that we shouldn't allow technology to control our lives. And I don't want to be, the negative person here, because at the end of the day, it's not about technology. There's nothing wrong with social media or search. The issue is this business model. We can have social media, we can have all these things we like without all the harm, but we have to have regulation and it's got to be antitrust for competitive reasons, and then you have to eliminate this massive market in people's most intimate private data. I mean, these companies act as though they're doctors, and when the doctor inspects your liver, that they then own your liver. I mean, that's ridiculous. Our data should be a human right. It should not be there for third parties to treat as an asset and to commercialize. They should not touch it. Nobody should be making any kind of mark in it any more than you're allowed to make a market in your kidneys or your legs.
Roger McNamee, what's been Facebook's role in what Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism? I know you've done events with her. She's the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power.
So Shoshana Zuboff, in my opinion, deserves a Nobel Prize in economics. I believe her book is the most important book on economics that I've read, maybe since Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or Karl Marx's Das Kapital. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I'm a true believer of Shoshana's work. So Facebook was a late adopter. Google invented surveillance capitalism. And when
Explain
Sheryl
how.
went from... So think of this as surveillance capitalism is really about looking at the world and realizing that there's data everywhere, and that if you captured all of it, if you captured all the data, you could convert human experience into data voodoo dolls that allow you to both forecast people's behavior and manipulate it. And Google's strategy was played out over a very long period of time. This didn't happen quickly. It took them at least 10 years before they were able to get it to work all the way through the system. But the basic notion is, you go into a product like Google Maps and you expect it to always give you the fastest route. But Google's mission in this is not always to give you the fastest route. It's to keep the traffic moving smoothly on the whole system. In order to do that, some of the time, some of the people have to have inferior routes just to keep everybody else moving quickly. And so that's just built in. Google's goals are different than ours. And the essential problem with surveillance capitalism is that it takes away our autonomy. It takes away our self-determination. And it interferes with democracy because, for all intents and purposes, they're now moving from manipulating us to manipulating whole populations. And Facebook's trying to do that with this cryptocurrency Libra that we're talking about this morning. Google's trying to do it with smart cities, what they call sidewalk labs. Amazon's trying to do it with all of its deals with police departments and other law enforcement agencies, and Microsoft's trying to do it with artificial intelligence. And because there are no rules, there's nobody protecting us. And I think it's our job to say, stop. We need to have a moment of reflection, and we need to have a trial. We need to put surveillance capitalism on trial and ask, in what world is this in the interests of the people? Because it sure doesn't feel that way to me. I mean, these companies are intensely profitable, but think of all the harm that's come out of it. It's just not worth it. And we can have the services we like without that business model, and that's the way the world should be. And that's why Senator Warren is so right in her approach to this, which is we have to restore competitive balance to the economy, and then we also have to deal with the problems of surveillance capitalism. And she's got both parts of it right, and she's the only candidate that does so far.
Well, how would you assess Bernie Sanders on this issue? Where do you think he's falling short, falling behind Senator Warren?
So I think Senator Sanders has come out against Facebook, but I don't think that he has spent as much time understanding the issue. I just don't think it's core to his portfolio of issues. I think he recognizes there's something wrong. I think I would trust Senator Sanders to bring in people to look into the issue. But it's not one of his core issues, where this is a core part of Senator Warren's platform. And I think fundamentally, capitalism is broken now. Surveillance capitalism differs from good capitalism the same way that Soviet communism would differ from it. It's all about, a mandated, highly controlled authoritarian regime. And it's weird because it's authoritarian but under the control of a corporation. And so in my mind, that's not something you should be permitted without a long public discussion. And, when I look at the candidates, you know, just because somebody hasn't made this a front and center issue doesn't make them a bad person. But I do give extra credit to the people who've put the most energy into this, because I don't think we're going to solve climate change. I don't think we're going to solve gun violence, anti-immigrant, or any of the other issues facing the country unless we deal with these internet platforms first. And, you know, Senator Warren just got started on this way before anybody else.
And do you think candidates, whether presidential or down ballot, whatever, are concerned about taking on Facebook because Facebook will then
Definitely.
take on them?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I worry a lot about Javier Becerra, who's our Attorney General in California, who's conspicuously not part of either the Facebook or Google cases. And I like Attorney General Becerra very much as a person, but they've obviously scared him into not engaging in this stuff.
I mean, that takes a lot. He's one of only like 3 attorneys general.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. And you know, I think the same thing's going on with Senator Harris, and I think the same thing's going on with Mayor Buttigieg. And I think there are lots of candidates all over, but the one thing that I think we can see is that this issue has reached a critical mass in the public conversation, and particularly in the political conversation, where you see members of Congress on both sides. You see departments of the Trump administration engaging in this. It isn't something that is inherently a polarized issue the way everything else is, because it doesn't matter who you are, you're being harmed by this. And you know, you may not recognize it, and that's okay. It's complicated. I mean, I spent my whole life doing this stuff, and look how slow I was to figure it out. So I have total empathy and sympathy for anybody who sits there and goes, Roger, this is really confusing. I go, you're right, it is. But all I ask people to do is engage with me in a thought experiment. Imagine that what I'm saying is correct. What would you want to do differently if I were right than what you're doing today? Because in 5 years, it's going to really matter if we do something versus doing nothing. And I'm hopeful that we're going to make the 2020 election a referendum on Google and Facebook and the internet platforms, because that's the fastest way to solve all the other problems in our economy.
And talk about how Facebook remains a threat to the powerless around the world.
So this is what makes me so sad, because none of this had to be this way. But Facebook and Google are so ubiquitous. When you have billions of users, you're forced to align with the powerful. There's just no way around it, because you need the permission of the powerful to operate. And so if you watch what Facebook and Google do, they do everything in their power to cozy up to authoritarians, to avoid getting pushed out of those countries. And then they basically spend their time defying democratic countries and challenging them to do anything about it, assuming that the users, we, the people, are going to protect them from any kind of accountability. My job, and I hope the job of everybody watching this show, is to make sure they don't get away with that strategy, because they are a tool of the powerful. I mean, what we learned in the Arab Spring, what we've learned with climate change, is that the powerful can use these tools every bit as easily as populist groups can. And they have way more advantage because they have more resources, they have more people and money to put at the problem, and they're going to do so. And we see this all around the world. We see in Myanmar in Asia what the UN called a textbook ethnic cleansing that was done by associates of the government. In the Philippines, Facebook has been used to essentially cause the public to support death squads that are extrajudicial killings. You know, we've seen the terrorism in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the killing at the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, and the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which is where I am now. And these things are all enabled by these platforms because there's nothing in the platforms to protect us from harm.
When did you last speak to Mark Zuckerberg?
Well, yeah.
How did he respond to Zuck, to your book?
Well, I have no idea. So I have not communicated with Mark since the 30th of October of 2016. When I sent the original memo to Mark and Cheryl, they both got back to me right away, and they couldn't have been more polite, couldn't have been more friendly, but they were also dismissive. They handed me off to one of their colleagues, who was a good friend of mine, and so I recognize
this
that,
is right
this
before
was
the
not
election.
I'm 9 days before the election, right? So it's a really prime period of time. So I have not had a real conversation with an officer of Facebook since February of 2017. Now, I know because they called ahead to many of the press stops I had on my book tour that they weren't super happy about it. But the reality is that I didn't say anything that I couldn't prove. And so as a consequence, it was mostly a matter of them just, using ad hominem and, trying to cast aspersions on the authoritativeness of what I was saying. And you know what? They're entitled to do that, right? It's a fair country. They can say what they want. I'm lucky because I've been successful professionally, and so they have nothing I want. But boy, they've been really successful at suppressing a lot of other kinds of dissent because they are so powerful. And they can go to politicians and make it very clear they can throw their weight behind a competitor. I mean, that's for all intents and purposes, Zuck is saying he's anti-Warren and pro-Buttigieg. And, that strikes me as just totally inappropriate. It may not be illegal, but I can't imagine that a company with that level of influence over the democratic process itself should be allowed to have anything other than a completely neutral position.
And now I wanted to go to a clip from earlier this month. The technology website The Verge published a leaked audio recording of Mark Zuckerberg saying an Elizabeth Warren presidency would, quote, suck for the company, and that he may sue the U.S. government if it attempts to break up Facebook.
Like Elizabeth Warren, who thinks that the right answer is to break up the companies, if she gets elected president, then I would bet that we will have a legal challenge, and I would bet that we will win the legal challenge. Does that still suck for us? Yeah. I don't have to, have a major lawsuit against our own government. That's not like the position that you want to be in when you're, it's like we care about our country and want to work with our government to do good things. And But look, at the end of the day, if someone's going to try to threaten something that existential, you go to the mat and you fight.
So that's leaked audio recording of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Senator Elizabeth Warren responded on Twitter by writing, quote, "What would really suck is if we don't fix a corrupt system that lets giant companies like Facebook engage in illegal, anti-competitive practices, stomp on consumer privacy rights, and repeatedly fumble their responsibility to protect our democracy." Earlier this year, Facebook temporarily took down ads by Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign that called for the breakup of big tech companies, including Facebook. The ads directed supporters to a petition for Warren's antitrust proposal. So, Roger McNamee, respond to all of that.
So, Amy, the first thing to think about is this. In a country as polarized as the United States is, and it's arguably as polarized as it's been since the Civil War, the one issue that seems to cut across the entire political spectrum is this one. People of all political stripes understand that there's a problem here. They may not understand exactly what the problem is or what to do about it, but they recognize that there's something wrong here. And this is really encouraging. So if you're me, you're an activist, I've tried to work with policymakers across the full spectrum. And I've been very fortunate. The Antitrust Division of the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission with Trump appointees have both been surprisingly supportive of looking at antitrust and other regulatory forms here. So that's good. Relative to Congress, I've had lots of people to talk to. Among the people running for president, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar have shown real leadership on this, but particularly Senator Warren. She has identified this issue from before she was a candidate. In the summer of 2017, we had long conversations about this, and I was simply blown away by the depth of her understanding. Senator Klobuchar, though, has a very clear understanding of the antitrust issues. I think she's very committed there. I think Cory Booker is a person who has shown a lot of interest in this, and we're seeing from Senator Sanders now some interest as well. There are a couple candidates who really concern me deeply on the issue. Senator Harris, because she's from California, I think feels a loyalty to Facebook and Google that's kept her from being a leader on this issue. And I'm deeply concerned about the relationship between Mayor Buttigieg and Facebook in particular. You may have seen the story this week that Mark Zuckerberg was surreptitiously helping the Buttigieg campaign hire key personnel. Now, this is going on at precisely the same time that Mark is openly criticizing Senator Warren, and in which Senator Warren has correctly posted ads on Facebook that are mocking Facebook's policy of allowing falsehoods. And I look at this whole thing and I'm deeply concerned because there is a lot of evidence that Facebook and Google, even if they do nothing conscious to affect the outcome, will still have a profound impact because they do amplify the most negative voices in any political struggle more than they amplify the others. In 2016, there was a message sent by a senior Facebook executive to a former employee that said that Trump had a 17-to-1 advantage of reach per dollar spent for his advertising on Facebook over Clinton. Now, some of that was just because they were clever, but 17-to-1, you don't get that just by being clever. A lot of that has to do with the content of the messaging, the fact that it was filled with disinformation, conspiracy theories, and hate speech really helped those messages spread. Not because everybody always liked them, but because it made people angry, and so they shared them a lot. And when I look at this in a political sense, I think that Facebook owes the country more than just its best effort. It actually should be held accountable for the outcome of this election. And in my opinion, if the company fails to protect us in 2020, that we should be open to notions like shutting the platform down. I think the same thing should be true of Google. I mean, these countries had a profound negative effect on democracy, not just in the United States, not just in the United Kingdom, but in Brazil and many other countries. And in my parents' generation, any company that had enabled the Russians to interfere in a U.S. election, I suspect would have been shut down. And it wouldn't shock me if the executives had been criminally prosecuted, because we didn't allow foreign countries to undermine our democracy. And yet these companies seem to think that that's acceptable. And as Americans, we should be better than that.
Mark Zuckerberg is on Capitol Hill today testifying before the Foreign Services Committee. The most important question, Roger?
In my mind is, Mark, should we allow you to continue to operate if there is any interference at all after 2020?
And let me ask you just very quickly, I was just interested, you were also an early investor in Wikimedia, and talk about the significance of what Wikipedia has done and how you would compare it to Facebook.
So keep in mind, I was an investor in the sense that I raised the early money that paid for the Wikimedia Foundation. So it's a not-for-profit. And I'm a huge believer in not-for-profit journalism. I mean, that's why it's such a thrill for me to be on your show. Because, you know, I worked for the National Geographic as an advisor. I worked with Wikimedia really closely. And I'm a huge believer in the world of fact. And I'm a big believer that not-for-profit journalism has structural advantages over journalism in the for-profit sector. And we see this every day. You know, the New York Times has this horrible inability to state the obvious. They have to do both sides of issues that only have one side. And, you know, that kind of stuff is the result of profit pressures. And journalism, there's a lot of amazing journalism being done today and a lot of really bad management of journalistic businesses. So I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia. I'm a huge fan of National Geographic. I'm a huge fan of public television and public radio. I'm a huge fan of Democracy Now! You know, I look at all of these things and I think, for the country's democracy to have any chance of flourishing, we need to have a vibrant, not-for-profit journalistic world, just as a counterbalance to the pressures that you see in the for-profit world.
Are you still invested in Facebook? You were one of its early investors.
So, Amy, I made a conscious choice when I began my activism to hold what remained of my position, which was substantial to me, because I didn't want to be accused of speaking negatively about a stock I'd sold. That was a year and a half ago. I have recently unloaded almost all of my remaining position. There are a few shares left, but I do not want to be a shareholder any longer. And, you know, I think that
we're going to have to leave it there. And thank you very much, Dr. McKinney, for joining us. Waking up to the Facebook catastrophe.